Welcome to the Underdog Chronicles. In today's episode, we delve into the reality of journalism in South Africa and the challenging journey of leadership with our special guest, William Sezoe. William is an award-winning columnist, freelance journalist, radio content producer, and presenter. His passion for education, politics, youth development, and media shines through in our conversation. Welcome, William. It's like such an honor to have you on the podcast today. Um, I think just before we kind of get into all the nitty gritty details of the interview, I did have a question that I'm actually quite curious to know your answer to. And the question is, what would you say is a type of food that reminds you of home, and why is that?
Hmm. Hi, Miriam. Also, your listeners. Thank you so much. For the food, I think so. I come from the West Coast, from a very small fisherman's town called Veldrift, and I think anything fish, reminds me of home. But crayfish in particular, I think would be, the food that really reminds me of my upbringing and really where I come from.
And I think speaking about like home and upbringing, could you tell me a bit more about like what home is? Like, could you take me to the place and like maybe even tell me how it's impacted you and influenced you to become the person that you are today?
Well, homes it was always sort of chaotic for me. It's something that I'm even still today trying to define for myself what that in essence really means. But home has always also been a concept that's been almost really too much to dive into. But in essence, I think what I would always try to remember is sort of the good things that came out for me. I think I remember growing up, as I said, in a small fisherman's town. It's always good, to be so close to the ocean. Would go there quite regularly. My dad was a fisherman, so going out to the waters and catching all these different types of fish. But I think what for me always takes me home is how we used to on a Saturday morning, early morning, would get up and we'd go something that people quite regularly do in the West Coast, is go fishing. So personally, I went fishing as well when I was quite young on a Saturday morning, and looking back today, it always takes me back. But also, I think the culture in the community that I grew up in is always beautiful to go back to and to look at, because I mean, being in the city these days for the past how many years, you sort of miss those small things that you used to do, playing in the streets, dominoes, so many beautiful things that we used to do as kids. And I kind of miss that actually, because I think the city life is so quick and fast, and people I feel like are less human in the city. They're less expressive of the emotions and what they're actually going through. It's more the cool and the vibe and the sometimes pretend. And I think I miss the essence of being human and being a child and being just brutally honest with life, because that's how my life was when I was quite young.
Wow. Okay. That's quite something. I think it's actually it's you're right. Like I mean, I think I've always grown up in the city, but I think I can imagine how growing up in a town where everything was just a bit slower, everything was just a bit more authentic, as you said, people are less guarded, they're less closed. Um, they don't have all of these weird complexities. Not saying that people who come from like small towns are simple, but because of the lives that they lead, they have this real beauty about them. They just they have this warmth to them. They have this way that you can just, when you go there, you can actually just, you just kind of decompress, you take a breath. And I can imagine how that like jump must have been from, from coming from a small town to like coming into the big city. Could you maybe like take me through how that was, that first couple months of you actually moving from a small town to now the big city? How was that for you? How was that experience for you?
Sure. I think in general, change is different. It's sometimes very uncomfortable, and it's something that we try to deal with in our own ways, of course. But I mean, I've had many times in my life where I moved and moved and moved and moved, whether physically or not. But I remember, I think I was 14 when I left home. I was 14 when I left home of my parents, uh, and I left, so from a small fisherman's town, I moved to a town called Paarl. It's classified as a city, but it's still a bit slower than a real city. But I think it was grade. It was the end of grade 10 that I left. Yeah, so I started a whole life in a new town or a new city in grade 11, not knowing actually what I was going to do, like which school I was going to go to. I didn't have a school at the time. It was it was actually just very chaotic because I left without making plans of where I was going. Um, so I found myself in a new town, not knowing people, not knowing the school that I was going to, and that was for me, I think, a journey of faith. Um, and that was for me one of the biggest, you know, moves that I've made in my life, and one of the biggest things that I had to adapt to at such a young age, and leaving my family behind, leaving my friends behind, and coming from that small town along the west coast, going to Paul, things were very different. And I was like, wait, what? Because now I basically found a school, and there was so many opportunities, and we went on school trips to Stellenbosch University, and I've never heard of a university, and I'm like, what? There's such a thing, um, and that's where I first heard of a university in Detlevin. And I was like, okay, this sounds cool. Maybe I want to do this thing called university as well, because where I grew up, the majority of my peers or kids that looked like me would either drop out of school or they would finish school, but then have the matric and go and work in retail, or what is most common in where I grew up, the fish factories. So they would go work at Lucky Star or whatever. And that was just a common thing. That's just the norm. And so, yeah, I am grade 11, and then I'm realizing there's such a big world outside of where I grew up, and I'm like, ah. So that was the first time that I really, I think I just wanted to share that the first time that I moved, and I've realized that there's a bigger world out there. And then I obviously finished the trip and then moved to Stellenbosch. Then I realized, oh, the world is actually so much bigger. Yeah, so that's it.
I can. Wow. Okay. So you moved from fishing town to
Mm,
Paarl, and then to Stellenbosch, and now you're in Cape Town. So
mm.
you've done quite a bit of moving, like quite the mover.
Yeah, like I've moved quite, like, even when I was still young, I've also moved a lot. So I was in a town called Veldrift. Then I moved to another town called St. Helena Bay. It's also a fisherman's town. And then I moved back to Veldrift, and then I moved back to St. Helena Bay, and then I've moved to Freedom, and then I moved to Paul, and then I moved to Stellenbosch, and then I moved to Cape Town. So I've had these weird interruptions in my life. Went to one primary school, then the other, the one high school, then the other, then the other, and I think all of that makes life completely chaotic because you're like a young child, and you need to continuously try and make new friends and adapt and try and reestablish yourself. But I think when I look back to it, I've had great experiences, equally bad as well. I had bad experiences as well. But it learned me to connect with different people across borders and generations. And I've had great learning experiences that I think that are today really carrying me. Because I went to one primary school and it was for me the best school ever. And then I moved, and then I found myself at a school where the teachers were still using corporal punishment. I was like, what is this? This is not allowed. Well, I didn't know it was part of the. I didn't know that the law stated that you're not allowed to, but just intrinsically it felt wrong. Um, and I went to the school principal and I said, "This is not it. This is not on. We can't allow this. I come from a school where I didn't get beaten up. Why are the kids being beaten up at the school?" Um, and at the time, the principal didn't really take much attention of me because who are you? You're new to the school. You just arrived and you're trying to make all commands and orders. And it doesn't work like that. And that was grade 7. A few months after my father actually passed on, I moved from Veldrift to St. Helena, and hence I found myself at a different school. And then I said to myself, I need to stand for the student council so that I can make a difference, make a change. So I stood for the student council and I became the head boy. And then I took this matter back to the principal and I said, well, now I'm the head boy and now I'm lobbying for the end of corporal punishment at the school because it just doesn't sit well. So I think that was one of the first things that the activist me tried to fight and tried to bring on.
Wow. Okay. That's hmm. It's amazing how like things in kind of like our childhood and in like our kind of our educational kind of phase of our life makes us kind of influences who we like, what we stand for and what we do later on. I mean, I know
Mm,
you've been very active on the front of like education, youth development, politics. I know especially with the NASFAS students, standing up for them, um, doing I think the second cycling tour that you've done, the 109 Ks, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah.
Always, standing up for for those who need it and for things that you think are like wrong and need fixing. Could you maybe tell me what really, I don't know, catapulted you into actually doing that in university? Because I mean, it's one thing doing it in a high school, but it's another thing doing it in a much bigger environment where you know where the change you make is colossal.
Mm. I think, there was some point I think in my undergrad where I reflected and I found that I've always clashed with authorities wherever I find myself, and I think that was exactly also the case with NISFAS, because I think in essence what I'm seeking is social justice, um, and essentially just seeking justice for people who cannot necessarily speak up for themselves or they would want to speak out, but there's always the danger associated with speaking up. When I reflect back to that story that I just shared with you, I was bullied by teachers after, bringing the story out because then there was the department getting involved. I got bad marks. I didn't get into high school because of them. A lot of things. So you get bullied, you get cornered off. People make threats against you, when you speak up. But I've realized, and because even when I started university, within my first week at Stellenbosch University, I got kicked out of class, um, because of raising things that just didn't felt right. I had some really bad experiences with the university management as well, but it's really just trying to speak up for people who can't and trying to ensure that what you're experiencing is equal, so that if I have a good experience, the person sitting next to me must also have a good experience. So I think that is something that just really drives me. And I think over the years at Stellenbosch, there were issues around transformation that didn't sit right with me. There was the university continuously claiming to be inclusive. And then I found it very problematic because I was like, you guys are selling this idea and kids are coming here with this idea because like, yes, and then they actually come here and they find it's not what you've advertised, right? You've sold a fake product to us. So in third year, I had a big fight with the university. I had many fights with him, but one of the biggest fights in my third year was was halal meals, right? And the university, I think they have over 30 residences, and only two of those residences catered for halal students. And for me, that was quite problematic. I found out the day I walked out of the class with a friend, and we walked to the student center. Now, the student center prices are much more expensive than the food in the catering residences. So she was sharing an experience of how expensive it is for her to pay for these meals in the student center. And I said, why don't you just take a meal from your res? He's like, no, they don't serve halal meals. And that's the first time that I found out, and I was so angry at this thing, and I made so many noise. Um, and the university labeled me, and they sent me some weird texts and whatever. And then I said to myself, I need to get into the space and try to make a difference from the inside. So then I said, I'm going to stand for the SRC. Went into the SRC, and then I tried to, I think, from my experience, bring a difference and be a different voice. I was in that office probably like most of my term and most of my years. Um, we would be there day and night. And then there came a point where, we had so many students coming there, sharing their stories about them going to bed hungry. And I couldn't understand this concept. Why are you going to bed hungry if you have a bursary? And so I tried to speak to more students, and I tried to get to the core of the issue. And then I've realized that each year, come around September, the food quotas of these bursaries run out. And then the students actually don't have any more quota to buy more food, and then the going gets tough, and then it's November exams, and kids go and they're right hungry. And it was just horrible listening to all of these stories because I didn't know how to deal with it. It was too much for me. And at the same time, the SRC is not permitted to buy food with its budget. So I really found myself in a very tense space of students coming there, and you can't do anything. And so I went to the university management and I said, there's a real crisis on this university, and it's called a student hunger crisis. So what are you doing? And they said, no, the vice chancellor asked me, well, what are you doing? And I found that interesting. And he said to me that he goes and each year he cycles the 109 kilometers, and he tries to raise funds for students who are hungry. When he goes around the globe to other institutions and he meets partners, he tells those people that he's running a campaign for people to boost some money into it, and then the university can buy food for these students. And there I sat and I realized, yeah, sometimes we just complain and sometimes we make noise, and we don't actually realize that perhaps there are efforts being made. And I said to myself that day, I'm going to be a little less of a critic. And I said to him, well, I'll join you and I'll challenge you in the 109. And that was one month away from the race, not being a cyclist, not having a bike, not having anything, coming from a disadvantaged background myself. What do I know about cycling? What do I know about the gear that I need to get in a helmet or whatnot? I didn't have anything of that. But yeah, then I participated, got the stuff that I needed to participate. And it was so nerve wracking going around Table Mountain, up the mountain, down the mountain. But I finished it, I think, within 4 hours, and I've raised a couple of thousand rands. And when I look back to it, I said to myself, at least you did it for something good. And you had fun. So, yeah, and this year I did my second one, although I'm no longer at Stellenbosch University. I just felt that, you know what, I want to do it again because the hunger crisis continues, and there's a way for me to give back.
That's it's quite the story. I think even before our interview, I was just looking at like your work, your journalism, kind of your take on a lot of these issues. And I came across this really unique aspect that I often don't see, that actually didn't see from, let's say, people at like in my university, like the SRC at my university, was you complain, you talk, you say all of these things to get you kind of voted in, elected, and often with good intention. But once you get into that office, it's like it becomes, kind of it's a kind of a silent kind of barrier between the student and the SRC. And one thing that I found really unique about you was you're not only raising your voice in terms of your journalism and in terms of your writing, but you're actually putting, your words into action. And I think that's really admirable. Um, and I think a lot of people want to do that, but they kind of don't do that. If you get what I mean, like they have these dreams of, alleviating poverty, alleviating, let's say, student hunger. But very few people take a stand on that. And often I think maybe it's because, fear, or as you said, some people just don't have the platform to, speak up for themselves if they're in that situation. Um, could you maybe share with me what gives you the courage, or I know you said the drive is to help people in disadvantaged situations, but what is that thing that really pushes you to turn that empathy, that sympathy, that compassion, into action?
Mm. Sure. Well, I think there are numerous reasons why people struggle to do that, and why perhaps also when people stand for elections, they say the one thing and then they get into the room and then they realize that actually I can't do that. I think sometimes you realize that there's just too much bureaucracy, the processes are just too much, or you become a T boy or T girl where you rather roll with the authority and you get some nice perks out of it. Going against the authority is it's difficult. It's a lonely journey, but that's what they say. Leadership is a lonely journey. And I remember my SRC turned against me last year when the news came out that our vice chancellor, he has been giving spaces for his cousins in the medical the medicine faculty, and they didn't even get good marks, but he placed them there. And then you look at all of these kids who had really good marks but didn't get in, and there was big debates, and it was said that this is nepotism. And the SRC felt at the time that the vice chancellor, there's nothing wrong with what he did, and staff members equally at the university felt that the rector, the vice chancellor, didn't do anything wrong, and they came out in protest where they said there's nothing wrong with this. And I go and I said, what? I sense that maybe not nepotism, whatever you guys want to call it, but the ethics in that. No. And so I wrote a piece and I asked, so by the way, where are these staff members when students are protesting about real issues? Where are they then? They're so quick to get up and protest for a vice chancellor who doesn't even care about you. So I think it's really a lonely journey, and it really takes a lot of courage to do stand up. I think for me, I think sometimes, I went through a lot of things in my life, and there were times that I could not stand up for myself. And when I look back to it, I regret that I couldn't. And I think sometimes it's because I didn't know that I could have. I didn't know that I could have raised up and said, this is wrong. I don't deserve this. Um, and then I think that's one of the biggest things that really, drive me, in the fact that I couldn't stand up for myself when I was younger. And now when I experience bullying and when I experience victimization, when I experience discrimination, I try to stand up for myself. But equally so, I believe that I also need to stand up for the person next to me. and that's what we do as humans. If you're a real human, and if you believe in you wanting to be treated right, you need to make sure that the person next to you gets the same treatment, even if that means losing a part of you or losing friends or family. Because I mean, there are times when people don't agree with you on things that you're saying. But I feel like if you believe that this is the right thing and this is, I need to say something about it, then do it. And sometimes people don't agree with you. I've lost I've lost a couple of friends, and I've lost family for things that I've done and for things that I've said, which I believe was the right thing to do. And I've lost big parts of myself in it. And in the process of seeking justice, you do lose a piece of yourself, because you'll write that piece and people will come back and say, how dare you, and this and this and that, and they'll try to ridicule you. And then you break down the next day and you melt down. It's like, I did the most stupidest thing of my life to say this. But then you look back and you're like, I did it for the right cause, and I know that it had an influence. And that for me, I think, is what's important. Because I mean, I have journalist friends who dumped me, and they said, "You can't be an activist. You can't be an activist. You can only be a journalist." Um, and then I always ask them, "But are you not human?" But anyway, I think that really drives me, the fact that I couldn't previously stand up for myself, and now I just try to do that.
That's it's actually quite empowering to like even hear you saying that. Um, and I think this will resonate with so many people, who have felt, powerless at some point in their lives and not able to, stand up for themselves and actually speak out. And as you said, later on, they're like, why didn't I speak out? Why didn't I say something when I could have? And I think I can definitely relate to you on the fact of, going against the current for something that you believe is right. Because in grade 12, I was in the prefect count. I was a prefect.
Yeah.
And there was, there was this girl that came up to me and told me about this bullying issue that was happening in her grade to another student. And the other student actually happened to be one of our foreign exchange students who was actually one of our foreign exchange students who was at the time didn't know a lot of English, was not that not that well versed and actually didn't end up communicating. Oh,
No, that's
um okay, so where was I? Okay. Um
Metric.
oh yes, so I was telling you about this time when I was in matric and I was part of the prefect body at the time. And a student came up to me to tell me about a bullying issue that was happening in her grade. To this girl who was a foreign exchange student who, first of all, didn't really speak that much English, and second of all, because of that, couldn't really communicate well. And in the end, it kind of served her lack of understanding of English actually helped her. But
Mm.
essentially, what happened was it was close to the time when COVID-19 came out, and it was kind of making its way throughout the world, and her classmates were being properly xenophobic to her, and like no one was speaking out about it. And so this girl came up to me and said, please, can you do something about it? And I was like, this isn't right. Like, what's happening is not right. Something needs to happen. So I tell this to my prefect body, I tell this to my head boy and my head girl, and they could not care less. Like, they kind of leave me on my own with the issue. And I'm like, this is a real issue. This is xenophobia happening in our school to one of our students. And we can't just sit back and do nothing. So I ended up calling like a whole meeting, and I was like, guys, we need to stand up for this. And yet they just I don't know what really happened, but they didn't they just let it be. They just like, "You're on your own, kid." And I was like, "This is not what prefix are for." So I got properly angry, as like, as you might have experienced before, many times. I was like, "What is this? We're here to stand up for student rights. We're here to make sure that school is a place where all students can go and feel respected and feel safe, right? And if that's not happening, what are we doing? We can't just be telling someone that their tie is, skew, and telling someone to
Yeah.
stop chewing gum, but we can't actually, try and solve real issues. And I was so, so infuriated by that. So me and one of my best friends, who actually was a prefect at the time, we were like, you know what, just you guys can do your own thing. We are like not leaving this issue alone. So we ended up taking that issue onto like the teachers and escalating it, and it did end up, being addressed. But I remember just the anger that I felt of
Mm.
people seeing something wrong, people seeing that there was an injustice being like going on and doing nothing. And I was like, how can you do that? And I think from that time onwards, I kind of lost faith in, let's say, the prefect body, because it's like, if you don't stand for one student, then how can we say we stand for all students? So I can definitely, in some small way, relate to, kind of what the struggles that you've gone through, and I mean the loneliness that you might have felt. And I think, yeah, as you said, like leadership is definitely a lonely road often.
Absolutely. But kudos for you. Kudos.
Thank you. And I think, just speaking on, stories of great impact in your journalism career, what would you say, or let's say in your journalism or even activism career, what would you say is something that really had a significant impact on you? Um, whether it was, something that actually caused a lot of change, or something even personally that caused a lot of change within you.
Sure. I think I think my journey, particularly with journalism, it like I always felt like my writing is bad, and I didn't really like it. And then in grade 11, so when I joined this new high school, I wanted to join the first aid team because I was always doing first aid after I left sports and felt like that's not for me anymore. So I this got to the school. I was like, "Can I do the first aid?" They're like, "No, you can't. It's only for our kids. You're new." And I was so discouraged, and I couldn't believe what was said to me. And at the time, I was like, "So what's going to be my hobby? Like, what am I going to do? Like, I don't know." And then a few weeks later, they were like, "There's an announcement for to join the school newspaper. You can join." So I went to this class. It was the same teacher that didn't want me to join the first aid, and I was like, this is not going to go well. And she's like, "Nope, you can't join. It's only for our kids." And I asked her, "What does our kids mean? Like, I don't understand this." And she's like, "No, if you were not at the school for at least a year, you can't do this." So I left. I came back the next day. She's like, "No," left, went the next day again. No, until she got fed up with me. It's like, "Okay, fine, but you'll be a backbencher." It's fine, I don't care. So I was there, as a so-called student journalist at the time. And then um, there were these short courses on, sharpening your skills at Stellenbosch University at the time. And it was just the whole time this teacher said, "No, you're not going, you're not going, you're not going." And then there was one where again she said, "You're not going." And then I think the evening before, someone dropped out, and then they asked on the WhatsApp group, and I was like, "Well, I'm available." And I think that's the first time where she gave me the opportunity after months. And that, I think, is where my journalism then started. So I wrote for the school newspaper, and then after that, in grade 12, I started writing for the local newspaper. And then I moved on to obviously university and the university student newspaper, then also Media 24 newspapers after that. Um, I think there are a number of stories that always, touches a person. Um, and I always try to seek the stories that will bring justice. And that's what I always say to my journalism colleagues, that okay, you can't be a journalist and an activist, but the work of a journalist in essence is sometimes activism, because people experience things in society, and they sometimes find difficulty in getting accountability and getting answers. And journalism is there to get exactly that. I mean, when I got chased out of that school, I was humiliated by that principal in front of parents, in front of learners, as he chased me out of that school. And it's a former white school. The idea of a teacher of color is it's too much for that. It was too much for him. Um, and my justice, for example, came through me speaking out, and I was like, God, what is this? And it reached a couple of newspapers, and then the Minister of Education then decided to look into it. And eventually, there was some action. But that's how I got my justice, and that's how I view journalism. That you try and bring justice in such a way. For me, that was also with the Nisvis case last year. So in 2020, so 2022, there was a report there was a report out that stated that there was corruption, and there was corruption in terms of how these four companies were appointed to distribute student allowances. Now, recognize no media company reported on that findings, and I found it particularly weird. And then at the time last year, I took the report and I said to myself, I'm going to break this down. And I don't write for the Sunday Times, but dear Sunday Times, publish this. It got published. And then it got picked, the actual report then started being picked up by other journalists. And then journalists started writing about it. And then it started getting to the minister and the department, and everyone starts hearing about this mess in this fest. And so I've got invited to a couple of radio interviews to debate with NISFAS and to debate with the department. And for me, what was the outcome of that was when the board eventually decided to establish or to call in Werksman's attorneys and say, let's investigate actually this thing. And that led to the report finding that indeed there was corruption. And that led to the dismissal of the CEO, who was deeply involved in that corrupt deal. And I think for me, that was a victory, and was a great victory also for students, because we were at the time like, yes, finally there's action. Government is dealing with corruption. The CEO is gone. I think that for me was one of the biggest victories, because for months students were going to bed hungry. They didn't receive their allowances because of this corrupt deal. And at the time, I thought that there would be hope. And this first has disappointed me again this week when they said they're in fact bringing back these companies. I think we're going to see a bunch of student protests again in the next few weeks. But I think that for me was one of the most beautiful stories, because of that act, we at least saw some change in how things were done at NISFAS.
That's quite the story. I mean, from seeing the issue to writing about it, then getting the Sunday Times to publish it, and then just this whole kind of what do you call it? Kind of this avalanche, of reports from journalists to people actually investigating it. I mean, that must have felt like one of the greatest victories. I mean, to see that amount of action from something that you did that kind of like just caused that whole chain of events.
Yeah, I think it really, but I must be honest though, there were times where I felt like it's gonna end very badly for me, because I would hear about, the CEO is actually uh, is a very dangerous person and doesn't like it when people question him. And here I was putting this thing out there and getting so much reports out of it. And then I went to the public protector and I said, you also need to investigate this thing. And I went to the Human Rights Commission and I said, you also need to investigate this thing. To the point where again it felt just very lonely because you had media giants reporting on it, and they were like, we had a connected force of journalists where we said we need to just put this thing out there so that it could trend. But when I went back to my university residence at the end of the day, it felt extremely lonely and it felt extremely dangerous because you are not only attacking this face and you're not only questioning this face, you're questioning the government and you're questioning politicians who might have actually received millions from this deal. And there you go and you think you have a shot at getting them down. So, extremely, extremely terrifying for me. Most of my life last year felt that the end is in sight because how dare you? People losing their jobs, how dare you? So it was terrifying as well. But I think, again, having that inner, I don't know, drive, I couldn't care less because for me, it was like, we're doing something that's right. And if I have to die for something that's right, then so be it. But terrifying, very much still terrifying. Even people at home were calling me, hey, you need to stop. This is dangerous. Like, our safety as well. I was like, don't worry, they don't know you. It's fine. They know me. They only know me. So don't worry. So yeah, I think people, also friends around me, was very terrified. Um, you know, so, but I mean, looking back at it now, I think maybe it was also just, I don't know, skepticism, but it was terrifying. But the good the good stuff that came out of it, I think that's what I try to look at, the positive.
Wow. I can imagine, like, I mean, can imagine how terrifying that must have been. Um, when it makes me, while you were talking about that, the I could see how your face kind of had this, kind of reminded me of what I think our freedom fighters would have looked like, when they were talking about things that they fought for during apartheid, and um, that they would be ready to die for that. And I think not a lot of people can say that. Um, and I think especially, I can imagine, especially in the line of, journalism and activism, there is that ground where if you step on, something, if you just make wrong step here, you're kind of like potentially dead meat. Um,
Mhm.
and I've read some of your articles, and they're not like, just, oh, this is like a sweet walk in the park. They're talking about real gritty issues. And I can imagine that, I mean, along your journalism career so far, you might have, had similar moments to what you felt last year. Does that like relate, or is that kind of like not what you're experiencing right now?
Well, I think at the moment my life is very freestyle. So most of my journalism work is freelance, and I write about it when I feel I want to write about things and when I feel in need. And if people really do reach out to me to say that, there's something, maybe look into it. So very laid back at the moment, to be honest. But that experience was not the only experience where I felt that my life was threatened. I've had previous experiences, particularly during my undergrad, of questioning and putting things into the media, that the big boys of Stellenbosch in particular didn't really like. So, I mean, there are the rumors of Stellenbosch mafia, but I think I've had a bit of a taste of that, and it's scary stuff when people who does not like public criticism tend to use ways that are threatening to try and keep you quiet. I believe that you know what, silence is violence. So I'd rather say it than being scared, because not saying it, I would hurt myself in the process. So I'd say it, and then you can come and use your traits or whatever. I don't care. I think obviously I'm still a very very young journalist. Like I still need to go into the much much bigger field, um, and I think one day I would love to do a more investigative journalism and just put things out there as it should. I don't think people would like me for that, um, but I think people deserve to know the truth, and I think people deserve to know what specifically government and particularly politicians are doing with their money. So yeah.
I think speaking of the truth, and I think earlier you did highlight on this duality that your duality that your journalist colleagues kind of brought to your attention, which is activism and journalism kind of don't go hand in hand, because I mean, on one side you're supposed to be objective, and the other side is you're obviously a bit biased because you're standing for something, you're standing on the side of something. um how do you manage that in your journalism right now? How are you managing to kind of maintain that balance?
Mm. I think at the moment I'm quite safe, and I think the reason why I'm safe is because I'm freelancing, so it gives me space to be this activist and to be this journalist at the same time, because I'm not subscribing to anyone's policies, which really makes the journey easy in terms of the flexibility, in terms of, as I say, Steve Biko says, I write what I like. And if you don't like it, then you don't like it. So, so that really, I think, gives me free reins. However, next year my life might be very complicated because then I can't. So at the moment, I'm studying with a bursary from Media 24, and I mean, even them, they asked me in the interviews, and they were like, "You're an activist, you're a journalist. You can't do that. When you come work for us as a journalist, not on a freelance basis, it's going to be quite different than working on as a freelancer." So I think it's going to get very complicated. I'm still trying to think about how does one do that, and how do you. I don't think you'd be able to do a balance. I'm thinking about it, but I still believe that you can put your activism through your journalistic work. For me, I mean, I had someone calling me sometime last year where they said that farm workers calling me saying that the farmer wants to put them out of their houses and so on and so on. Can you come talk to us? I went to that farm and I talked to some of the community members how they were feeling about it, and I walked out again a few hours later, and I got a call from the community, and they said, "Actually, you don't have to write the story anymore because the farmer heard that you were here, and we're not being kicked out anymore." So I think you really carry power through journalism. You can really bring justice to people. But also I think it's also about being a journalist, and how you position yourself as a journalist, because I think there are journalists who are, and I think media in general is being seen as pro government or pro authority or pro establishment. I think it, yeah, maybe yes. I think it really just depends on the journalist. If the journalist wants to be pro establishment, then the article will be pro establishment. I'm not pro establishment. So I think that also is why some people hate me. But I mean, you've got to do what you believe is the honorable thing. And maybe, yes, as you've said, it could be some type of bias. But if something is wrong, then it's wrong.
Sorry, there's a kitten outside my window right now, and they're
Oh,
just meowing. Um, but I think what I was meaning before on, on being on the side of activism in terms of bias is you have to take a stand. With sometimes with journalism, or my experience with it is it's a lot of fact telling. You're telling the facts. You're telling them this is what happened. This is how so and so responded. Um, and then activism is actually saying this was wrong. What this person did was wrong. But I mean, I'm
yeah.
sure now that you're actually in the journalism environment, is it like that? Or would you say people are taking more of like a stance in their writing, as you said? Like, I know you said pro establishment, but are there people who are, let's say, I guess, putting a bit of emotion into their writing?
I think a journalist has the power to determine the outcome of what they're trying to say. And you, as a journalist, set the agenda for your story in essence. And if you want your story to come across that this is wrong, then you make sure that the people that you quote have the experiences of how they feel in the situation. If it's bad, then you quote those people. So in most cases, you would have journalists that would only quote uh, for example, in a protest, right? So in a protest or a student protest, so you get two type of journalists. One would quote and say, "Oh, it was disruptive, it was violent, it was whatever," and then they would quote the authorities, which could be the university or the government, that says, "Yeah, it was awful." Da, 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 da. And then you have your story, and it portrays the students as lazy, or they don't want to work, or they were just disruptive. Then you have another type of journalist that could come and say, I'm actually going to speak to these students and actually try and ask them why they are protesting instead of focusing on the physical appearances of the protest. Let me ask why they're here. And that sort of brings the justice in, because now you're taking the story from the ground and you're actually taking the experiences of the students and putting that into a story. So I think that's the two type of differences of journalism that we see. And particularly with the Fees Must Fall, I think studies have shown that the media has actually framed Fees Must Fall as anti-students, or students must fall, and not really fees must fall. Um, and so I think journalists really carry the power. They don't have to list their emotion. They can't, of course, because then the objectivity goes out the door. But the objectivity can also fall out of the door if your story is not balanced, and if your story does not at least try and bring in the experiences of the people that are going through the most. And I think we can even see that with what's happening Israel Palestine. Some media companies would be pro Palestine and some would be pro Israel. In essence, it would be who they are quoting and how they position the articles. And I think that's how you can also use your activism by trying to bring out the stories. Just a few weeks ago for me, I got a call and someone sends me a letter. The University of Stellenbosch kicked out over 40 students, uh, and I was like, wait, what? It's like, okay, I'm gonna come and I'm gonna try and see what's happening and try and find out what's happening. And then at the same time, I heard that the public protector is coming to Stellenbosch on the same day, and I knew that students were gonna go protest there. And I was like, yeah, let me go find out what's happening. And what makes a story good is engaging with those students, and what brings the social justice in that aspect is your presence as a journalist for one. And if you are empathetic with the students. So when they spoke to the students, and then after that, I could go to the university and say that, listen, I've seen this letter, you've kicked out students. Secondly, I've spoken to these students coming from small villages across the country, coming from disadvantaged circumstances, and you've decided to kick them out. Now, one, for them, that's a brand issue, their image, and how will that make them look? And thirdly, the public protector was there and she was seeing these students sitting outside in the cold. That's another brand damage and image damage for the university. So immediately after I've reached out and I said, well, I am writing this whether you like it or not. 1, 2, 3, the university made efforts to place these students, and I think that is what your work can do if you're willing to 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 be like that. If you're willing to empathize and if you're willing to seek justice through words.
It's quite something. I think my next question I was actually going to ask you what advice would you have for people wanting to become journalists, but I think that was it. That was I think a lot
I
of
would
what
I would say one thing though, so I'm in the film and media class, and there are a bunch of kids who want to do journalism, but the industry doesn't pay well in South Africa, so that's the bad part of it. But the good part of it is that you get to give a platform for people's voices, and you, as an activist, you are the voice, but as a journalist, you can give a platform for people to be there to raise their own voices. And I think that's the beauty of it. And if the more, I think the more we can do that, uh, the better we can try and reshape society. Because then, remember, the people who read these stories are people who make the decisions. These are the people who sit in the boardrooms and get a newspaper every morning. Hey, what's the news? And they can actually see what's happening in the country, and they can try and at least think a bit differently when they are in those boardrooms.
so would you say that is another thing that you'd like to add in terms of for people who are aspiring journalists, things that they should keep an eye out for? I mean, in terms of the monetary aspect of it, but also
Mm.
just the influence you can have and the platform that you can create.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great platform to influence decision making. It's a great platform to make voices heard, and it's a great platform to give government account, particularly government, because they don't like bad news about themselves, and they will try their best, level head best, to change the narrative. A good journalist is someone who keeps on knocking on the same door, on the same story. Sometimes you'd see like there would be a big thing happening in the country, and every news company is writing about it. 3 days later, the story is dead. What makes a good journalist? The good journalist is the one that keeps on following that story until there's another thing, and you're the first one to try and break it. So don't let the story die out as well. I think that's also where the justice dies. If you allow the authority to make a big announcement, because they make big announcements and then 1, 2, 3, we're like, yeah, there's going to be a change, and then we'll forget because now we're distracted by other news. So yeah, I think it's really a great platform to bring change. It's a platform to bring justice, and I think you would have also heard, but I mean, with the 6-year-old girl from Saldanha, who got lost, is it now a month ago? Um, it would not be possible for the whole world, because the whole world now knows the story about this girl. It would not have been possible if if it was not for the role of a journalist who went and said that, this small child coming from this small community, people don't know her story, but I want to go and I want to know her story and I want to put it out there. And within days, it was a countrywide story. It's now a worldwide story, so much so that people across the world are also searching for this child. And I think that can really that could really be the power of what it means to be a journalist, if you're willing to go into the areas and go into the stories that some journalists do not like. Some journalists write from their homes in Camps Bay or wherever, and they write these stories and they have no ground knowledge of what's actually happening. And we need journalists who are willing to go to the ground like an activist and actually find the real story.
And I know that our time is coming to a close, but I just have two more questions that I wanted to ask you. And I know that you said that we in South Africa, we need more journalists on the ground, people who are willing to go that extra mile to actually hear like hear about people's agony from the people, not from someone else. Um,
Mm.
do you see this? do you see this movement rising? Like, I mean, even in your degree right now, do you see people wanting to be more of that kind of journalist, or is it a mix?
I think there's a great need for that. The problem, however, the problem is that over the years, media companies commercialized, yeah, is that the word? Because of social media, traditional media is having a very hard time to compete because social media is so much easier, so much quicker, um, and it spreads so much faster. Um, However, there is, of course, disinformation and sometimes misinformation in that social media journalism. And so media houses are finding it incredibly difficult to stay relevant. Um, and then obviously also with COVID, it was really hit hard in South Africa where many of the media houses had to let journalists go. So what we're currently seeing in media houses is less journalists, more work, and they are underpaid. So what's happening is that these journalists are not actually not really going out anymore because the company might not be able to afford for you to go out. So a very few of the companies can afford it, but they can only afford it to a limit. So there's a great need in terms of that. Then also in the past, media houses used to have many editors. They'd have a sub editor, they would have a English editor, they would have a content editor, and they would have the sub head editor and all of these editors, right? And so because of the industry and because of the things that I've just mentioned, they've started cutting all of these posts. Now you just have a journalist and an editor. And what we've also seen in terms of the journalism arena, that the senior journalists are no longer comfortable in the space because they're being more underpaid by the day. So what the companies does is they get junior journalists, they get babies in, but these juniors don't have knowledge of everything. So the way they write their articles are not always so comprehensive, or it lacks this or that, and then it's not really a good article. The other issue that we've identified is that newsrooms no longer have specialist journalists. So you have someone writing about the environment, but this person knows nothing about the environment, and then the article is quite weak. So that's been happening in the media houses of South African newsrooms the past few years, and which is sad. So I think not only does South Africa need more journalists, it needs investment in journalism.
Okay, so you'd say there is a lack of journalists now because of, the kind of the after effects of, let's say, COVID-19 and maybe other um, things that have happened. But there's also a great need for, more investment in these companies because now you're actually kind of, what's the word? You're actually neglecting kind of the quality of information and also the quality of writing that you get from journalists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's also happening is that so very few of the companies are do actually have capital. And they can probably thank apartheid for that. And what they're doing is that they're recruiting the best out of the struggling industries or the struggling news companies, and then they take it for them. And so those struggling, shame, those struggling newsrooms. I feel so sorry for them because remember, for this, so this one journalist, and we worked very closely on the Nisfus case last year. So he worked at the Sunday Times. I think he worked there for a number of years, but he has done so much work with the Sunday Times. He broke so many stories for them, and the way the economy is looking like, and with all of those other challenges, that man is now at News 24, and it seems like quite a few others are moving to News 24 because the pay rate is a little bit better, and the other companies I think is just really struggling, and I think so we need investment, and we need new journalists to come in, not for the money, but to try and establish their own brand, of course, to allow uh, great platforms for people's stories to be heard, and then maybe later on make it a money issue when you have a good profile. I don't know.
I think looking ahead, what kind of impact do you hope to leave through your work? In journalism, writing, and your activism.
Mm. Well, I actually don't know where I'm going, right? So, activist, teacher, journalist. I was in politics for some time, and then yeah. So now, at the moment, obviously, so I'm studying. Then I have to do 2 years of work for me to 24 to work back my bursary. Um, and then I don't know where I'm going after that. But I think one thing is very clear for me, that I will always be an activist, whether my workspace allows that or not. I'll always try to find ways to seek the social justice and the change that I want. Um, and whatever the future holds, I think it will always be a platform. I'll always find myself at a platform where I'm able to be a voice, but I'm trying to be less of a voice. I'm trying to be more of a platform for other voices to come true. Um, but I think for me, I'm a patriot. I love South Africa. I think we have great country and we have great value and we have great worth. And I'm hoping that we can get more people in this country who are equipped and who are ready to get them out there and to say, use your voice, use your talent, and let's build a better South Africa for all of us. I think, of course, the country still has a very long way to go, especially because when we look at the inequality, it's the most unequal country in the world. And the question we should be asking ourselves is that what are we doing wrong? Not only as a government, but what are we as individuals doing wrong? Because I think each of us can play a role in redirecting the country in a space where it should go.
Thank you for coming on the show, and I'm sure that you've like when people hear this, they're going to be um, greatly, I think, astounded, inspired, and they're gonna they're going to take a lot from this interview. And once again, thank you for your time.
Well, I hope so. And thank you so much for hosting me. It was really nice to have a cool sit down chat. I haven't done radio or podcasting in years, and it really brings back those memories as well. So thank you so much, and keep on, creating a platform for voices to be heard, and so that other voices could hopefully come alive from that.
To keep up with William's journey and insights, follow him on X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word by telling a friend about us. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe, underdog.